Hi, this is Chris at Clever Unicorn Games and the Unicorn Collective, back with another one of our designer interviews. Today I have Eduardo Baraf with me. How are you doing today, Eduardo?
I'm well. I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good. Tell me, what is it you like to do when you're not making or designing games?
Um, that's a great question. I mean, I think to some degree I end up playing a lot of games, obviously. Um, you know, I have a wife and two kids, so I love spending time with them and going out. There's not, we don't do as much normally. I might say rock climbing, um, but been, playing games and been playing some League of Legends. Um, just pretty relaxed stuff. Our kids are hitting a good age now where one's 12 and one's 10. So if you watch some of the language or some of the content, we can start showing them older movies that were
Yeah,
like super cool movies. Like, for example, like we saw The Matrix
yeah,
for the first time. Things like that, like classic movies that aren't like, are hip enough that they're interested, but old enough they have no idea what it's about. So that's been a fun bit there. So, whatever everyone else does in a quarantine or whatever it is. So,
Are you still on lockdown where you are?
yeah, I mean, not, from a job and school perspective, yes. So
Yeah,
I work from home. The kids are from home. Many businesses are closed. You can't dine in. Everything's still, so effectively, it's eat and live at home. Once in a while, we'll get food from somewhere.
yeah.
That's about the most interesting, and you can get to a park, but that's about the most interesting thing there is.
Yeah, no, I mean it was like that for us for a while. Luckily, I live on a very small island, so where they closed the border. So now we were 130 days without a case, until recently when they kind of semi-opened the borders and people were coming back from holidays, and then now we've got like 3 cases again. But it's not too bad. As
I
far as
think 3 cases. I think I got cases like in a block of where I am. So I think you're doing just
we're
fine.
okay here. Yeah, we're okay. Yeah, so life's pretty much gone back to normal at the moment for now. So touch wood, desks made of
Oh,
wood.
that's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, still kind of working from home now though, because unfortunately through COVID we had to get rid of the office, and I've moved to doing all my stuff from home now. But in a way, it's kind of not changed anything because I was only working at a computer anyway, so it's not made any difference
Sure.
apart from not having rent to pay on an office. So, yeah. What is your favorite game?
Favorite game? It's a great question. I tend not to be a favorite guy. I really like games for different situations and scenarios and stuff. So it's really who you're playing with, what you want to do. I mean, in terms of board games, I was always fan of Stratego and Small World and those types of games, along with Risk, of more modern stuff. Even though Small World's not that old.
It's
I
getting there now. It is getting on a bit as
Yeah,
games go.
I mean, I don't know. It's more about what I like lately. I mean, I love games. It's very difficult for me. I definitely grew up in the Nintendo generation of consoles and stuff. So, I have a strong like of all those classic games on the Nintendo side, whether it's Zelda, Mario, Metroid, that kind of thing. But no, really, I have to. I play so many games. I find I try to enjoy things, um, and yeah, I don't have a favorite color. I don't have a favorite food. I just have things I like, and I like lots
Enjoy
of things.
everything.
So that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, what inspired you to start creating games yourself?
Um, I've had the good fortune of doing something related to games my almost my entire career. So I played a ton of games as a kid, right? I loved games, and actually at that time I really never thought of making games. But I went to the University of Michigan in the States, and at the time I was, they sent this magazine that was like, here's all the 1,000 clubs at the University of Michigan, and I looked at it and I was like, oh, I'll join a video game club. And the only one was a Dr. Mario playing club, which was an
Okay.
amazing thing. And so at the time, I was sort of like, well, that sucks. I guess I'll make. Well, I didn't. I think I was complaining to somebody once I got to school about that same story, And they were like, well, why don't you just make your own club? And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, you just need 5 people. You make your own club. It's like no big deal. Um, and so I did, and I started Wolverine Soft, which was a game playing and making organization at the University of Michigan. I made Crisis Wolverine there, which was my first game, and then from that, I got a job in the video game industry doing Q&A, then production, then running game development studios. And then at some point, a while later, I started. I really up until that, like Catan, Small World, you know, Citadels period. Up
Yeah.
until there, like my board game world was like Monopoly, Risk, Clue, that kind of thing. And so I started playing those games, and I friend of mine who worked at a company I worked at, Thomas Denmark, who's the designer of Dungeoneer and the artist of Dungeoneer, was working on a game called Murder of Crows, but was having a hard time with he knew what he wanted visually, but was struggling with the design a little bit. And we teamed up. So that the first credit design, board game, card game credit design I have is for Murder of Crows with Atlas Games, who published it. I sort of I was snuck in that, like, Thomas already had the deal, so it wasn't like I was effectively, I was sort of a developer. Like, he brought me in to help him with a game that was already signed, so to speak. Um, but so fast forward some time, I was at Bluefang Games, which ultimately Zoo Tycoon fame. But they were getting shuttered, and we had been working on some Facebook online games, and they were all getting shut down. And like, I had a very strong visceral reaction to this idea of, like, in video games, especially online games, like when they're down, they're gone. They just disappear. And so I wanted to make something that was like that I could make and keep and like have in 30 years. And so I ended up doing the basis of the design for Liftoff, Get Me Off This Planet, did some prototypes, and then ultimately went to publishers, almost signed with Queen Games, but didn't, and went to Kickstarter. So I sort of went directly to Kickstarter with Liftoff. It was a success, that campaign, and from there, I ended up doing more of my designs and then working with other designers and partners, and drove ahead. So it was really that sort of was that. That's how I got going, so to speak.
Yeah, that's interesting as well, and yeah, you've touched on something there. I mean, we've spoke about video games and board games and how they kind of go hand in hand on this show before. Um, but yeah, it's the first time we've touched on the fact that yes, board games, even though the video game market's a much bigger market than the board game market, video games are kind of flashes in the pan, where it's very rare that people will remember games with nostalgia. But me personally, there's games I played years ago that loved and I've tried recently, and because of the way everything's progressed, I've not enjoyed them as
Sure.
much as they used to be. Whereas a board game, if you make a good board game, it can easily outlive a video game. Mainly, I
Certainly.
think it's because it's in your purview, it's in your house, it's on your shelf. Whereas with a video game, as soon as you press off on the console, it's kind of gone out of your mind.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth there. I would note that I think not all games are the same, but there are plenty of games you go back to and you sort of say, like, "Oh, they're just better versions of this game now."
Yeah,
Um, and the other thing is, like, eventually, the one thing that video games don't take a lot of is space,
yeah,
and board games take up a lot of space. So you may end up getting rid of a board game that was old because you need to. But no, I agree with you, and I do think, um, it's been one of the pleasures of making games and starting Pencil First Games. I have this sort of set of product that I built in on, because everything professionally, I make games, right? So
yeah,
professionally, I make all these things for other people that I don't own. Oftentimes, with I've worked with a lot of IPs. I worked at Disney, so like there's a lot of you don't. Frozen's Frozen. You don't.
yeah,
It's their thing. You're just helping
yeah.
them with their. I mean, you work for them, but you're helping them with their brand. Which at Disney was always funny, because like the heart of Disney is this guy who's like, I don't want to sell my stuff to anybody.
Yeah.
Um, and then everyone working there is making stuff for him. Anyway, um, uh, but so yeah, I think there's some differences there.
Yeah, and that's another thing as well that I think video games now as well, because there's so many people involved, it's like nobody really knows any of the names behind the games apart from the publishers. And in the board game world, it's kind of the same as to a certain extent, but there's more chance of you getting your name onto a box. than there is with video games, if you know what I mean. So people are more likely to notice you. But unfortunately, it's a smaller market again, so it's probably not as many people. Um,
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
uh, in your experience from taking games from the drawing table all the way through
Mm-hmm.
to market, have you ever
Sure.
hit, and this is for board games, have you ever hit a barrier or a hurdle that stopped you dead? And what did you do to overcome that barrier? And this is probably more prevalent on something you've done for the first time. So, or it might have been something that's happened later on in your creation career.
Well, I mean, you know, I mean, you're like a barrier that stopped you dead, but then you overcame, and then so it wasn't really a barrier.
Well, it stopped you
Right?
semi-dead.
Seven.
You came
Um,
back from life to life like a phoenix and overcame it.
yeah, I mean, you get examples of that all the time. Looking at Liftoff, we spent a lot of time working on making the game and getting it to a good place, and then I shipped it for a publisher, and they had it for a year. It was going through. It had gotten to like sort of the final consideration, and then I guess they had at the time sort of like an all thumbs up approach where if a couple people didn't want to do it, they didn't do it or whatever. I don't know the inner workings, but it didn't get picked, right?
Yep.
So after waiting a year and a half to find out, it was there was nothing, right? And at that time, I wasn't as familiar with Kickstarter and understood the scene. So it basically it sat on the shelf. It stopped.
Yep.
I had these really nice prototypes of Liftoff, and it wasn't until and so that was dead. I mean, we just I was like whatever, and it wasn't until like a year after that that I was at a game night with a number of folks in the Bay Area, and I don't know if my wife elbowed me or we were talking about it, but basically blocked the game
Yep.
and played it. And people were like, "Why aren't you putting this up on Kickstarter?" And I was like, I don't know. Like, well, I guess I could. And so I did. At that point, I decided to do it. But like that had been stopped. Like that was it was an outside event that like got it back on the docket. Um, you find all sorts of challenges with perhaps you're working with an another really hard challenge is I was working on the siblings trouble, which was going really well, and it was in tabletop deathmatch, which was an interesting experience all out of itself. But at the time, it's like a 200 card game or 180 card game, I don't remember, and I had an artist who had done like 5 or 6 for the tabletop deathmatch. They had helped as well, but then it didn't work out with the artist. The artist couldn't do anymore. So
Yep.
suddenly, I found myself with like 175 cards of art to do, which is a ton of work.
Yep.
Um, and because of the way things were set up, you know, I, I had to figure out a way to get that art, and it was just sort of dead in the water. But then I ended up negotiating a deal with an art partner I had in the video game space where they did all the art for that game for me while I product managed and ran a mobile game development for them. So I basically
Ah.
bartered a different skill set of mine to operate and help them develop a game in return for like
Yep. Old school.
$25,000 of art or something, right?
Old school
Like so.
style. Old school
Yeah,
trading.
yeah, yeah,
Trade
yeah.
one product
And
for
but
another product. No money, just product for product. Yeah.
yeah, well, but so it turned. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, that was that meant at that time it was. I had a full time job. I had this hobby with this card game, and then I had a second job from like 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. doing all this management of stuff. So it was crazy. But so I think ultimately it's. I guess what I would say is this: I don't really think of things as barriers, just so much as challenges and difficult things. And so having gone through and made so many products over the years, you just learn that's part of the process, and you got to come up with solutions and be pragmatic and thoughtful. And some solutions are harder than others, and sometimes you don't get there. Um, sometimes, especially, there's definitely been times where you are working on a game idea, and you're like, this just isn't fun. And I've now done this 3 to 4 different ways. and I'm going to keep this idea perhaps for some future thing, but otherwise move on. And you just sort of get a feel for it as you go.
When you are designing a game, so when you have the idea for a board game in your head and you want to start making it for real, what do you start with? Where do you go first?
Well, so at this point, and I appreciate that a lot of these are sort of game design questions, but I've really sort of I think of myself a little bit more as a game maker than a game designer. And the distinction for me is very often I'm working with somebody who I'd consider the game designer. Typically, I start like either I've started games in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's about working with people. Like I really like enjoying working with this person. I want to work with that person, and it's about just us talking and kicking something off together. But oftentimes, there's a thing I want to make or a product I want to make, and I get inspired by a piece of art. I get inspired by a theme. I get inspired by a mechanic, whatever, and I'm like, oh, that wouldn't that be cool? And then and I say, how can I go about doing that? And so, like some examples of there, like Herbacious is a very good example of that, where Beth Sobel had this art that she reskinned Bonanza with herb art, and I remember
Oh.
seeing the art and thinking it was incredible, and asking her, and she was like, "Oh, I just reskinned this game." And at the time, I was like, "Wouldn't it be awesome if there was a game with art like this that appealed to like my mom and like a bunch of players who I can't get to the table all that often?" I think there's a game like that. And actually, for a while, I wanted to make a solo solitaire like type game where you like have your tea and you play the game, with this beautiful herb art. Anyway, I signed her up to work on it, and well, she had already done a lot of the art, so like I had been like, hey, can I use that art and like 3 or 4 more pieces? And she was like, you mean more art? And I was like, no, those exact herbs. I might need a couple more. And she said, sure. Um, but I struggled with the solo design. I hadn't done that many, and I didn't want to make it. I really basically wanted solitaire. I wanted something that was like super easy to learn and play, but I didn't, obviously didn't want to just make solitaire with herb art. Um, and so I was struggling, and then I talked to Steve Finn, who's good, who I'd known back and forth, and we had talked about doing things,
Yeah, I've
and
spoken
said,
to
"Does he
Steve.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah, does he know solitaire or solo design?" And he's like, "Well, not so much. I tend to make multiplayer games." He's like, "But I could make a multiplayer game with that stuff," and I was sort of like, "Sure, let's do it." And then so you just it started with that product space I wanted, and then we got the rest of the way. So I mean, it really it just depends. They all come together differently. Like right now, um, a game that's been long in development and step by step moving is a game called uh, Codename. I don't think it'll ultimately be called this, but Time Empire. I mean, this thing's been in development for like 6 years. But the idea there was like, wouldn't it be cool if you had a time travel game, but like rather than time travel in the context of individuals, it was in the context of like empires, and you were like empires like an empire builder, but you were like then traveling through time to like steal secrets and like change the past and then like have this sort of and so like that was like some weird idea, and then it was like trying to work out and build what that game would be like, and that game went through a lot of I have a lot of versions of that game with Andy Ashcraft, but like so I think it just for me it's as much about products in a product space as it is about having fun and working with people and doing cool things. I've been working with Vincent Dutrait, and I'm a huge fan of Hanafuda. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but these are these old, like 400-year-old or however much Japanese style game cards. It's sort of like a poker deck, but it's 12 suits of four,
Oh, right.
and they're like made
I
of
have seen
plastic.
that. I have seen them. I've seen somebody at a gaming club bring them, but they were at a different table, so I didn't see what they were doing. But I have
Yeah, yeah,
definitely seen them.
it's a very specific thing, but I'm a huge fan of it, and we've been working together. And like on that one, it'd be like, wouldn't it be cool to like do a Hanafuda deck with Vincent? And I was like, hey, what would you think? He'd be like, that'd be cool. So like, you know, I, and I this, it's like one of those things where nothing suggests to me that it would make money, right? Like, it would just be something fun to do. So I think it's a combination of things, but to me, it's really about the experiences. Like this, it really is. what I do for pleasure and enjoyment and passion. So like it's not. I try not. I like literally my working in video games. My job is about getting something done on time, meeting expectations, and making money. And so like I try not to bring all of that structure to what I do at Pencil First Games.
Yeah, no, that's a very good answer. What have you ever played a game or a type of game and not liked it? You don't have to mention any names of games,
You
but
mean
what
like
what was the
a game, a specific
yeah?
game, or a
You don't
genre?
have to make a specific. If there's a genre or a theme or a mechanic that you really don't like, what is it? You don't, like I say, you don't have to mention any games. You just think
I
of them.
mean, yeah, yeah. I mean, there have been countless games that I don't like, so there's plenty of things I don't like. Um, I mean, I like to play lots of things, and I like variations. So, all right, something that games will do that I certainly don't like is um, I'm not a big fan of a game that you can't play successfully the first time you play it, right? So there are a lot of games, and there's some different examples, and even Skull Hollow might be an example of one. But at least when you play Skull Hollow, you have fun when you're playing it. But like um, I don't like playing a game and then like using the first time I play the game to learn how to play the game.
Yeah,
I like a game where like I can bring the game to the table with a new group of friends
yeah,
and say, "Hey, let's play this game," and everyone plays it and feels like they've participated, not I won and everyone else
yeah,
you know, didn't know what they're doing. So like that's not necessarily a mechanic, but it's sort of a pet peeve. Or also games that like force you into 10 decisions before you know what's going on. Like, hey, you need to pick these three goal cards, or you need to do this, or you need to draft, but you haven't played the game yet, so you don't know what to pick. I don't I don't like that feeling when you're like, I'm supposed to make a decision, but I don't know the levers, so I'm just going to pick randomly because otherwise it's going to frustrate me. Like that is a very bad moment in gaming, I think.
yeah.
And so I'm not a big fan of that one.
What piece of advice would you give from your experience to a new designer coming into this with an idea in their head, thinking of making a board game? What would you say to that person?
Oh, sure. I mean, certainly, if you have the idea in your head, just make it. Like, don't like try not to fantasize about riches. Try not to fantasize about sales and success and accolades. Right? Like, just think about that game idea in your head and prototype it, make it, play it with other people. Like, I think for the first time you are making a game, you might as well make the game you're thinking about. And then ultimately, maybe it doesn't go the distance or whatever. But like, I think if you get too caught up in those other factors, um, again, as a game designer, it can sort of send you along, on the wrong path. I mean, to some extent now, right? Like, I have enough. Like a great example of this is just look at people who indie boutique publishers on Kickstarter who have done a bunch of Kickstarters. Generally speaking, their first game is like a little weird. It's a little, it looks like a first time game.
Yeah,
Maybe the art isn't as good. Maybe the mechanics aren't as good. Maybe it isn't as cohesive. And then over time, if this person's still around, you'll see their Kickstarters get tighter. And then if you look, typically, if there's somebody who's gotten to the 4, 5, 6 type of range, what'll happen is early is a little sloppy, next one's tighter, but then the third or the fourth ends up looking more like they thought about where they wanted uh, the ball to land before they took the
yeah,
swing. Right? They're like, I want to put this product in here with
yeah,
this audience and this look and this style because now they're no longer just
yeah.
making games. Now it's a product and a business, and they're like, I don't want a game here. I want it there because there's no one else there, or so. It's a progression, but I think for a first-time designer, just make your game and don't worry too much. Try it out, have fun, build it, and then maybe try to make it or not. But I think just have fun making the game.
So yeah, thank you very much for coming and speaking to me today, Eduardo. This has been brilliant.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.